Okay, I'll just start at Hebrews chapter 7, verse 1 and read. For this Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of the Most High God, met Abraham, returning from the slaughter of the kings, and blessed him. And to him Abraham apportioned a tenth part of everything. He is first, by translation of his name, King of Righteousness. And then he is also King of Salem, that is, King of Peace. He is without father or mother or genealogy, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, but resembling the Son of God, he continues a priest forever. See how great this man was, to whom Abraham the patriarch gave a tenth of his spoils. And those descendants of Levi who receive the priestly office have a commandment in the law to take tithes from the people, that is, from their brothers, though these are also descended from Abraham. But this man who does not have his descent from them received tithes from Abraham and blessed him who had the promises. It is beyond dispute that the inferior is blessed by the superior. In the one case, tithes are received by mortal men, and in the other case, by one of whom it is testified that he lives. One might even say that Levi himself, who receives tithes, paid tithes through Abraham, for he was still in the loins of his ancestor when Melchizedek met him. Well, there's a lot in that passage, and it continues for the rest of chapter 7. And so what we'll do today is just kind of get oriented and get maybe a little bit of a background on what's happening here with what's being taught. You'll remember in Hebrews chapter 5, if we remember just where we had been, in Hebrews chapter 5, verse 11, the writer says, "About this we have much to say, and it's hard to explain since you have become dull of hearing, for by this time you ought to become teachers." And you'll remember we went through that. And he had just in chapter 5 mentioned that in verse 5, "So also Christ did not exalt himself to be made a high priest, but was appointed by him who said to him, 'You are my son, today I have begotten you.' And he says also in another place, 'You are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek,'" quoting from Psalm 110. So he mentions Melchizedek. Then he says, "About this we have much to say, but you're not hearing so well." And he takes kind of an off-ramp there and talks about that as we considered for a few weeks. And then now he's coming back to the issue of Melchizedek. He kind of has a parenthesis there in the middle of that. Melchizedek, I want to talk to you about Melchizedek. But now, look, you're not thinking too well, and you're dull of hearing. And now he's coming back and dealing with Melchizedek. So the big idea, the overarching idea, is that Christ's priesthood is greater than the Levitical priesthood. That's the big picture. Jesus is greater. Christ's priesthood is greater than the Levitical priesthood. Now, that would have been a complete and absolute shock to these people to even consider something like that. We'll think about that more in just a few more minutes. But to even approach that kind of a teaching would have just exploded the minds of these people. And so the writer of Hebrews has to go into kind of a nuanced argument. It's a true argument, but it's nuanced and it's a little complicated in the argument that he is making here, and we'll sort that out here in a few moments. So just some background here as we get started. In your listening guide, you have this diagram I put together. And that's just to reorient ourselves as to where we are. God calls Abram in Genesis 12. He changes his name to Abraham later, but he calls Abraham. And then Abraham has a son, Isaac, who has a son, Jacob, whose name is changed to Israel. And then Israel, Jacob, has sons, and they're the 12 tribes of Israel. Okay, that's a quick review there. So when Abraham is called, we have thought about in the past the Abrahamic covenant, that God makes a covenant with Abram, and Abram obeys. And the nation of Israel, for all of their history, even up to today, looks back to the faithfulness and obedience of Abraham. And then there's these 12 tribes, and I highlighted the tribe Levi. So these 12 tribes come along, and it turns out that in order for God to be approached, there's going to need to be a priest involved. Somebody's going to need about that work, that priestly work. There needs to be an intercessor between sinful people and holy God, and those priests will come out of the tribe of Levi. So we have the Levitical priesthood. That was their role. Other tribes that had other activities, what they did, but for the nation of Israel, it was the tribe of Levi was responsible for the priestly duties for the nation. Now, that little text box that's out there to the side says Moses and Aaron. Moses and Aaron, his brother Aaron, come out of the tribe of Levi. So Moses and Aaron are Levites. Really, it's important here to see that Aaron is a Levite. Moses too, great Moses that he is. But since all priests must be Levites, God says Aaron will be the high priest. So all of the sacrificial work, the offering of the sacrifices, going into the Holy of Holies, the once a year, that'll be done by the line of Aaron. Out of all of the Levites, the line of Aaron, they will be the ones that are doing the religious priestly work. Now, the other Levites, they assisted the work that those in the line of Aaron did. As I say, that line of Aaron, they're giving the sacrifices. The others are in security for the temple, for example, probably singers, probably instrumentalists, these type of things. Levites, that's their work. But there's a line there with Aaron and his following, and that is the line that the high priest would be coming out of. When we read about the high priest think about it during Easter, we think of Resurrection Sunday, that time it's coming early this year, but it's coming soon. We'll think about the high priest. They're in the line of Aaron. So, in order to approach God, you and I, anyone, would have to go through a Levite, would have to go through someone in the Aaronic, the priesthood of Aaron, have to go through the high priest. The high priest offers that sacrifice once a year for the atonement of sin. That's what that chart is. I'm hoping to just kind of remind you of that. These are things we've visited before, but just remind you of it. It's nuanced for sure. So in order to come to God, you have to go through a priest that's in this line right here. Exclusivity. You can't just decide, somebody can't just decide, I want to be a priest. You have to come this bloodline. It's not whether the person was righteous or lived a good upstanding life. It's whether or not they had the bloodline. And that comes along into the picture with the law of Moses. And now about 1,400 years later, the writer of Hebrews is saying, Jesus is greater than these priests. Do you feel the weight of that? They would be going, what? My grandpa, my uncle, and my ancestors, all of them understood that we can only approach God through the Levites. And you're saying, what? That Jesus is greater? They would have been in shock. They would have been in shock. They would have been just stood right up on their head and would not have understood it whatsoever. So the big idea is that Christ's priesthood is greater than the Levitical priesthood, and that diagram there helps us just to see some of the flow of history. So the priesthood, the Levitical, and I have /Aaronic, Aaron priesthood, was intended to make clear the holiness of God and to beware of approaching God in a haphazard way. All of this description of the tabernacle and then the temple, and all of this description that about the priests and their garments and their way they behave, all of that is a picture to say God is high, holy, God is in a majestic place, and God is not to be approached in a very casual way. In fact, God can only be approached by a certain individual, and that certain individual needs to come through the line of Aaron. It's the only way that I can be approached. You, as a sinful human being, have to have your sin atoned for, and the only one that can do that is coming from the line of Aaron. The point of that is to show the great holiness, the great majesty of God. So when you're in the Old Testament doing your reading, Leviticus, Exodus, and when you're doing that reading, know that the holiness of God is at stake. It's the holiness of the Most High God, the Yahweh, is at stake. And that's how to approach God is being described. I have a reference there in your listening guide to Leviticus chapter 10, verses 1 to 3. Those are the two sons of Aaron himself, who were called to be priests in the line of Aaron, of course, and they were struck down because they offered strange fire. And then we later read in 1 Samuel about the priest Eli. And Eli has these sons, Hophni and Phinehas, and they don't approach the worship of God like they ought to, and they both die the same day. They are judged by God. All that is to say that God is high, holy, powerful, and is to be approached in an honorable and a respectable way. So this Levitical priesthood made it clear the necessity and the importance of a God-approved intercessor. The priests, high priests, the priests that served in the temple had to have that family heritage. They had to be of Israel. And they had to identify with the Jewish religion, highly nationalistic, highly Jewish. They're about the task and about the work of offering sacrifices, and those sacrifices weren't permanent. They had to be renewed year after year. A priest couldn't be a king. I mean, it was unheard of in Israel for a priest to be a king. Hebrews chapter 7 verse 1 says, "For this Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of the Most High God." What? Priest of the Most High God and a king? Highly unusual. Melchizedek, highly unusual. They had to be in the right family, and all of these sacrifices that they went through and offered were only temporary. This is all in the background, in the thinking of the people of Israel, the Hebrews, to which the writer is addressing. We have to understand that the priesthood, one of the messages it gives us, that there's a necessity, and it's highly important, exclusively important, that a God-approved intercessor be in place for a person to approach God. I know some of you are already ahead of me here. Jesus being our high priest, we can approach God through Jesus. Yes, we'll get to that. That's true. But we want to be careful. I mentioned exclusivity a few minutes ago, actually a couple of times already. And in the history of Israel, there is an exclusive God. There is one God alone, not three gods, not 330 million gods. There's one exclusive God, and that God is to be approached in a very exclusive way. That message has not changed. That has not changed. That's consistent from the Old Testament into the New Testament. Therefore, we can come into the age that we live in now, and we hear people say, well, God can be approached any way. It's the same God by a different name, but God can be approached in any way that we think is appropriate, whatever feels right for you. What changed? Nothing changed. God's heart, God's attitude is the same. God can be approached only in one exclusive way. And we know from the New Testament that way is through Jesus Christ alone. So this idea of multiple pathways to God is foreign to the whole path, the whole tenor, the whole trajectory from the Old Testament into the New Testament. The disciples, Matthew, John, the Apostle Paul, Jesus himself would not have understood anything about coming to God just in any old way you want to come to God. They wouldn't have understood that at all in the Jewish mindset. It's very, very exclusive. Quickly, it might help us just to get some context again. This teaching that the writer is addressing about Melchizedek comes out of Genesis. So we could turn to Genesis chapter 14, and I'll highlight a couple sections, and you may want to dig into it a little later this week. But in Genesis chapter 14, we let our eyes come down to verse 18. And we see in Genesis 14 that what had happened is Abraham and Lot, they both become very wealthy. So Lot is Abraham's nephew. They part ways. Lot goes the way of Sodom, goes and lives over in that way. Abraham goes over to the land of Canaan and settles there. Lot gets into trouble and he gets himself captured in a war. And Abraham goes and he rescues him and defeats the enemy, but rescues Lot. That's so very important there. And then there's the spoils of war that are present in that story as well. And we pick it up here in verse 18 as Abraham is returning. He passes by the way of Melchizedek. Verse 18, Genesis 14, and Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was priest of the Most High God, and he blessed him and said, Blessed be Abram by God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand. And Abram gave him a tenth of everything. And the king of Sodom said to Abram, Give me the persons, but take the goods for yourself. But Abram said to the king of Sodom, I have lifted my hand to the Lord God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, and I would not take a thread or a sandal trap or anything that is yours, lest you say, I have made Abram rich. I will take nothing, that what the young men have eaten, and share of the men who went with me, Let Aner, Eshcol, and Mamre take their share. So the writer of Hebrews is referring to this account of Abram and Melchizedek, and that's before the Mosaic law is given, as we see here in our chart. Just real quickly also in Psalm 110, these are passages the people would have known very well. Psalm 110, verse 4. The Lord has sworn and will not change his mind. You are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. So in that passage in Psalm 110, verse 4, after the order of Melchizedek, the writer of Hebrews is saying Melchizedek is of a different order than the Levitical priests are. And not only that, Jesus Christ is of a different order. So that word order there is important in Psalm 110. Just our background. These are the only places Melchizedek is mentioned. That's what kind of makes him, Melchizedek, kind of curious to us. There's not a lot of discussion about Melchizedek and who he is. A little bit. The writer of Hebrews unfolds it more than any of the others. So there's this exclusivity regarding approaching God, and there needs to be a God-approved intercessor. So there's the issue of a type. And Melchizedek is a type, a likeness. Now, a type is a person or a ceremony or a practice that points to something greater than itself. A type is something we find in the Old Testament that points to something much greater in the New Testament. For example, the Lamb of God. Well, there's a spotless lamb that's given in the Old Testament sacrifices. A lamb given, and that lamb, that picture of that lamb points to something greater, and the lamb is Jesus, the perfect Lamb of God. Now, a type doesn't match in every detail with the counterpart to it, what is laid out in the future. Maybe only one thing is pointing towards that type. But a type takes an activity or a person, and it's pointing towards this reality out in the future. Another example would be maybe you remember that in the Old Testament there's the bronze serpent. God judges the people, and they're complaining against Moses and against God, and so he sends serpents. These fiery serpents, and the serpents bite the people. And God says to put a fiery serpent, bronze fiery serpent, up on a pole, and whoever looks to the pole will not die. Well, that's a type of Jesus Christ being lifted up, and whoever looks to Christ in faith will escape the fiery trial that would otherwise await them. Obviously, the fulfillment of the type doesn't need to be bronze. Jesus wasn't bronze. And it doesn't need to be a serpent. Jesus wasn't a serpent. But there's a truth in that picture that points to something greater. And Melchizedek is a type. He's a type of the real thing. He's a priest, a king and a priest. Jesus is king. Jesus is priest, pointing to something greater, the fulfillment of what we get a glimpse of in just a small way with Melchizedek. So that's what's at stake here with the writer to Hebrews. He's saying, look, Jesus is greater than the Levitical priesthood. He's greater than, you need to look to Jesus as your high priest. This is a new concept to the people he's writing to. This whole idea of priesthood is found only in Hebrews. It's a new concept being introduced. And he's drawing on an example from Old Testament Abraham. Prior to Moses, all of the law that was given, he's drawing from an example there and showing them something about, look what happened with your father Abraham, who you revere so deeply. Look how he dealt with Melchizedek. And this man Melchizedek was of a different order, the order of Melchizedek. So then he unrolls forward these arguments that he has. See how great a man, verse 4, how great this man was to Abraham the patriarch, gave a tenth of his spoils, gave a tithe. And those descendants of Eli who receive a priestly office have a commandment in the law to take tithes from the people, that is, from their brothers, though these are descended from Abraham. In the Jewish worldview, the descendants of Abraham were, the descendants of any ancestor were in the loins of that ancestor. So what he's saying here is, look, you're a Levitical priest. Levi himself gave tithes to Melchizedek because he's in the loins of Abraham. This man you revere so much, Levi had given these tithes to Melchizedek. So as we look all down through this passage here, there are these arguments that the writer is unfolding. When an offering is given in that context, in that history, when an offering is given, the offering is given from the lesser to the greater. And then when a blessing is given, the blessing is given from the greater to the lesser. So the idea being, and that's what he unrolls here, and as we read down through verse 5 and in verse 7, it is far beyond dispute that the inferior is blessed by the superior. So that's their worldview. A blessing comes from one that is superior. So the one who's superior to Abraham of all people is Melchizedek. And the offering is being given, the tenth is being given by the lesser to the greater, because the greater is the priest of the Most High God and King. So there's that kind of an argument. As I just mentioned, he also argues in verses 9 and 10 that, look, when Abraham gave his offering to Melchizedek, Levi was in his loins. He was going to be an ancestor. He is the ancestor of Levi. And not only that, these priests that are in the world today, their ancestor is Levi, whose ancestor is Abraham. So in their worldview, look, in the loins of Abraham, Levi himself, and these priests, they're giving to the greater, and the blessing comes from the greater to the lesser. These priests are lesser than Melchizedek. Again, going back to the history, 1,400 years of Levitical priesthood and approaching God through these priests and through the line of Aaron. What? You're saying what? That there's somebody greater than Levi? There's somebody greater than Abraham? Yeah, Melchizedek. And then there's the argument that these Levitical priests, they ultimately die. But the writer of Genesis didn't see to it to give us any account of Melchizedek dying. It's not that Melchizedek himself is eternal. It just wasn't important to the writer. So the writer of Hebrews is using this picture to communicate. Look, Melchizedek is not, he's superior one in one respect because the offerings are given, greater to the lesser. He's superior in another respect because your ancestors are the ones that are present right now or that you're thinking about were in the loins. So, and an offering was given to Melchizedek. And not only that, Melchizedek, there's no record of him. He just was not anymore. There's no record of him dying. All of that, those lines of arguments that are coming through this passage, all of that to say, he's building the case, Melchizedek is greater than these Levitical priests, and he'll get to it, Jesus is greater than Melchizedek. One thing that many have pointed out over the years is that when we read in Genesis 14, Melchizedek comes out and gives gives Abraham bread and wine. And so they try to make a lot of hay out of the bread and wine. And they say, well, maybe that's a type of the Eucharist down the line, except that the writer of Hebrews doesn't mention it. The bread and wine appear to be simply refreshment that was given to a tired and weary individual and a group of men that were surrounding him. They had been in battle. If it had been so important, the writer of Hebrews would have specifically mentioned it, since it's specifically mentioned in Genesis. All right, just background. I know it's a lot, but by the time we get to the end of chapter 7, I think it'll come together. This is the background that they're working with, the audience is working with, thinking of, and what the author is trying to communicate. So Melchizedek is a type. He's a king and a priest. Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of the Most High God. He is worthy of great, great dignity. Now, here we have to stop just a minute and back up. What's at stake here? A lot of history, yes, a lot of history. A lot of trying to understand a complex argument in history. Yeah, there's that. But what's really at stake is that Jesus Christ is Lord. Jesus Christ is worthy of great dignity, exclusive dignity. He's a king. Anyone who would claim him as their Savior, he's a king of their life and is to be treated as a king. Anyone that would think of even approaching God, talking about God, the Most High God, needs to deal with the priest of the Most High God. Much of this is absent in the world you live in. Jesus is a good teacher. He's my buddy. I sing songs about Jesus. He dressed kind of cool. He's Lord. He's King. He's priest. And the message of Hebrews chapter 7, what I want you to get from it, not only today but the weeks ahead, that Jesus is greater. He is so awesome. He is greater. Don't try to equate him with some priest in the Old Testament or in the New Testament. Don't try to equate him with Moses or equate him with Abraham. Don't try to equate him with Melchizedek. He is the greatest. And therefore, He demands and has the right to your submission in all of your life. That's what's at stake. So Melchizedek, as a type, deserved great dignity, both as a king and a priest. You might find it interesting, you break the words down. Melchizedek, means my king. Zedek, meaning righteousness. The king of Salem, that word Salem is closely associated with shalom, peace. And in fact, we read here that the writer mentions that in verse 2. King of righteousness. He is the first, by translation of his name, King of righteousness. And then he is also King of Salem, King of peace. That is, King of peace. Salem pointing to Jerusalem. A great dignity is owed and deserved to Melchizedek, in that his ministry, the order of Melchizedek, is independent of any genealogy, and there's no record of an end to his priesthood. That's just not important to the writer of Genesis, and that's not important to the writer of Hebrews. The writer of Hebrews is taking a picture, he's taking a type, and he's using it to establish his argument. It would be something akin to today, someone saying, you got to keep your eyes on Jesus. And remember Peter, when he got out of the boat, he didn't keep his eyes on Jesus. He's using a story to establish his point. That's what the writer's doing. He's using this story to establish a point that the people had never heard of before, never thought of Melchizedek in that way. Jesus comes out of a tribe too. He's the Lion of Judah. He comes out of the line of Judah, not Levi. Oh, and you want me to approach him as high priest? And he's not even out of the tribe of Levi? You can imagine these people would have been scandalized. Yeah. Jesus is worthy of dignity and respect. And his position, his priesthood is not dependent upon some earthly genealogy. And his priesthood continues. Melchizedek was treated with great dignity by none other than Abraham because he received a tenth, or he received a tithe from Abraham. Now, just briefly on the tithe that Abram gave Melchizedek. Some teachers try to take that and build a teaching that tithing a tenth is required today, because this takes place prior to the Mosaic covenant. So someone says, well, we're not under the Mosaic law, we're under grace. Right, okay, good. Well, this took place before the law, so some teaching is built upon that. But that's not correct. That's not the correct teaching. In the New Testament, we're taught to give according to your heart, your conscience. In the New Testament, God owns everything. We are simply stewards. He owns it all. We don't own anything. We may think we own something compared to this person over here. Well, true enough. But God's in the picture for the Christian. We don't own anything. We are a steward of all that God has given us. And so we're called to give as God has prospered us and made it possible, and given out of the joy of our hearts. And one day God will hold us accountable on how we handled the resources that He gave us. How were they used to advance His kingdom? That's in the New Testament. It's not a law from Melchizedek that you're required to do this. Someone might want to give 40%. Someone may be able to give 5% or whatever it is. But it's out of the heart of the person and how they want to give. So just mentioning that as a caution on your hearing of Melchizedek, this teaching being taken to teach a certain approach to tithing in the New Testament times that we live in. So, Jesus is greater. He's greater than all of the patriarchs. He's greater than all of the prophets. He is the high priest of God. And my hope for you and for me is that as we go through Hebrews chapter 7 and the rest of Hebrews, of course, we fall deeper and deeper in love with who Jesus is, and so that we want to honor Him. Not that we have to, we want to. But because He's so magnificent and so great, and He gives all of these spiritual blessings to those who follow Him, which may or may not work out into material blessing, but spiritual blessing nonetheless. He's so awesome. He's so great. He's of a completely different order. I want to worship Him. I want to honor Him with my life.